Hi, I'm Virginia Eskin. How many times does a composer need to revise a piece before he's satisfied with it? Roland Nadeau is going to tell us all about it on A Note to You. Today we're going to revisit another gem from the archives left by the late Roland Nadeau. Roland was fond of this kind of program, where he could just share his enthusiasm for one of his favorite composers. In this case, it was Beethoven. Beethoven must have agonized over his opera Fidelio, and over its overtures in particular. Since we have 4 versions, Roland had his chance to cut us in on how Beethoven made changes in his music.
He wrote the first version of his wonderful opera, his Singspiel, actually, because there was some spoken dialogue in it, in 1805. That was the first version, Opus 72. And then next year he did the second version, and then it took quite a while before the last version came in 1814. And during all of that time, he was experimenting with writing the right kind of overture that would work for him for this great opera. So he wrote 3 Leonore overtures. One of them, the first one, that I consider to be really not the best of the 3. It's a fine piece, of course, but not the best. I think it's the weakest of the 3. The first one was not done for the first performances, but we'll have to include it here today, at least in part. All of the 3 Leonore overtures are connected musically in some way. They all start, for example, on the pitch G, the octave G, then they do something different after that, but they do have that. They have the basic organization, the same architecture all the way through, a slow introduction, and then some fast, lively music, and then at the very end, a brilliant, bright coda. Every one of them has that. And then the one thing that they really have in common is this melody. And in the first Leonore overture, you will hear that used very extensively by Beethoven. Now, that particular tune is the one that is associated with Florestan in the story, Florestan being the husband of Leonore, and he is incarcerated, he is in jail, and he sings this beautiful melody in the dungeon just at the beginning of Act 2. And it does come in each of the 3 overtures, so I thought that I would let you hear it, this section only from the first Leonore, because that really is the only connection between the 3. Second and third are really very much related, as we will see. Anyway, you'll hear this theme, and then you'll hear it in another key, and then in another key, and he keeps building upon it, almost as if it were part of his development section. But actually, it is not. It is just an interpolation of this melody that he considered to be so important that he used it in all 3. By the way, it does not appear in the Fidelio overture that we're going to be hearing at the end. That's a totally different piece, and we'll talk about that later on. Anyway, from the Leonore number 1. Now, here is the Florestan theme, Adagio ma non troppo. Okay, that's about all that we'll have time to hear from the first Leonore overture. Now let's take a look at number 2 and number 3. The second Leonore was the one that was performed for the first version of Fidelio in 1805, and the third one was the one for the first performance in the next year of the second version, okay? They have a lot in common. All of the major themes are common to both of the overtures, but the way in which they are treated is very, very different, and the little details that you will see that are different. Sometimes some big details actually show you, I think, the creative process of Beethoven as he tries to improve upon himself from the second to the third. They both start in a very similar way. The overture number 2, Leonore number 2, starts with the G octave that we talked about before, double forte, and then down the scale for a couple of pitches. Some rest there, then he does it again. This time he doesn't stop, and he goes right down the scale, a C scale actually. Here we are on G natural, and then a very big surprise, an F sharp. You say, my gosh, that's a mysterious sound. And the chords make it sound as if it's going to this key here, and it is for a little while B minor, a 2 sharp key, and then at the end of that little section, this chord, a very typical Beethoven chord, a dissonant chord, what we call a dominant minor ninth chord. Ooh, it's got a lot of bite to it. This chord, and it leads right to the clarinets singing the beautiful Florestan theme that we just heard in Leonore number 1. And so forth. Let's listen to it now, the opening of Leonore number 2. All right, that's the way he begins the Leonore Overture number 2, Beethoven does. And notice, by the way, the very, very slow tempo adagio. It's about as slow as you get without stopping in music. And now let's go to the parallel one in Overture number 3. He begins, as we said before, with the same note, the G, but this time, instead of making that false start down the hill 3 notes down, he holds that long G for 5 beats instead of 2, and then just simply goes down the scale. So again, double forte with the timpani underneath it. He writes diminuendo. We aim for the same F sharp, the same mysterious unexpected pitch, and then we go to the key of B minor, and then the wild chord, the strong, trenchant minor ninth chord. Suddenly we are in the luminous key of A flat major, and the theme comes back that we heard before, the Florestan theme, but it is a little bit different near the end. And remember this little figure here that you heard in the second Leonore. That is entirely missing, that F flat down to the E flat. He simplifies the end of it. So here's the way he does it in his third Leonore. So, as you heard, they are very, very similar, the openings of his two overtures, his two Leonore overtures, number 2 and number 3, but they are not quite the same. Beethoven has grown, he has changed, he has looked for something different, and things have happened creatively. Same thing happens towards the end of the Adagio introduction in both overtures. If you have heard it before, you probably have been struck right over the head, really, with this fantastic, loud A-flat chord with the flashing scales, this part here. In the second one, what he does is he stops on that chord there, the A-flat chord, and then with almost interminable rests, you wait, and there is nothing. One, and nothing, no music, and no music. And then he does it all over again and ends on a different chord. And then for a long section, there are these very dramatic pauses in the music. I want you to hear that now in the second, and then we'll see what he did, trying to improve upon that in the third. Okay, let's see how he does that now in the third, and let's see what happens to that section. The same thunderous A-flat chord, this time Beethoven says triple forte, even louder, and the same scales, but he only does it once, and when he gets down to the bottom of the scale passage on the A-flat, instead of those long rests now, he puts in the woodwinds chords. And then a big crash again. All the way through that passage, there always is something to fill in there. And then he will make his transition, and then you will end up, of course, with the beginning of the Allegro section with his first major theme, the one that you just heard in Leonore number 2. So, Leonore number 3 now, towards the end of the slow introduction. Compare this now with what you have just heard. There is another musical section that occurs in both of the Leonore number 2 and number 3, and that is the famous section with the trumpets that are sounding, symbolizing the coming of the governor of the province to the fortress to find out what is going on there and what is going wrong with this tyrant Pizarro. And so you hear it in both versions. Now, in the second Leonore, you hear it in the key of E flat, and you hear it this way. These are the trumpets singing. Etc. They are actually outlining the E-flat major triad. That's what they're doing. And then right after that, there is a reference back to the first theme. Remember the one that we just heard a couple of times? In the key of the tonic, C major, you hear a brief reference to it. Starts playing with that a bit, and then stops it, and again the trumpets in E flat with the fanfare theme. Da 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 da. After that, a strange chord comes in. This one here, very very soft, and an interesting rhythmic figure afterwards. Da 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 ba ba. Sounds like this on the piano, of course. Strange, mysterious, diminished seventh chords. That little passage ends on just the rhythmic figure, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, down at the bass. Some long pauses, then again, and then you listen very carefully and you hear above it the Florestan theme. And all the way through the singing of that theme, da-da-da-ba-ba, continues. That occurs just before the final coda of the work. It occurs very late in the second overture. When we hear it in the third overture, it is much further towards the beginning of the piece. But anyway, here is the famous trumpet section from Leonore number 2 by Beethoven. Well, there it was, the very famous offstage trumpets in the second Leonore. Now, it happens again in the third, but as I said before, you go back towards the beginning, and in the development section is where the trumpets are heard in Leonore Overture number 3. The key is different, by the way. That was E-flat major. Here, he is in the key of B-flat, and you hear a trumpet fanfare again, not quite the same as before. Etc. After that, there is no reference whatsoever to, as there was in Leonore Overture number 2. Instead, he brings in a brand new theme, this one. But curiously, what he does retain from the second is the rhythmic figure that we highlighted for you, da-da-da-ba-ba, and it accompanies this brand new melody all the way through. So, Leonore number 3, the famous trumpet entrance. Well, there it is. The music is essentially the same. The thematic material is very, very similar, but somehow they are different. He has done something else with it. And whether you like the first version and the second better than the third, well, that's up to you entirely. I personally think that he improved as he got to the third. I like the third the better. And that's, by the way, the one that we're going to be hearing all the way through in a minute when we put it all together. Let's now move to the coda that is marked to be played presto by Beethoven. And you hear the very famous scales building up to the presto. Little figure like that, very soft. This is now from the second, and then these fast scales starting soft and making crescendo. The strings are going like crazy, and then finally the presto begins with the first theme that you heard at the very beginning of the Allegro. But this time the tempo is presto, and he makes it much, much faster. It'll go like this. So you will want to watch for that. Instead of da-da-da-da, the highly syncopated figure, you're hearing da-da-ba-da, twice as fast, as a matter of fact, and in a presto tempo. In addition to that, you keep listening to the coda, a very exciting coda, and you get to the section, double forte, that is highly syncopated with these wild chords, always coming in between the beat, anticipating the beat. 1, 2, 1, 2. A very important part of the excitement of the final culminating presto. So, Leonore number 2 again, now the very end, the presto, with the build-up in the strings with those very famous scale passages. That's the exultant finale, the last presto section, what we call technically the coda of the Leonore number 2, and it's very exciting, but I really think that he outdid himself greatly in writing the coda for Leonore number 3. There is still the same sort of calm before the storm, before the scales come in, but rather than having just these little figures that we heard before, the 3 notes, and then sitting right there, you hear staccato, you hear this, and again, and then the presto begins. So the scales now crank up the excitement, and he says crescendo, and then as you look at the score, much longer passage, by the way, of these scales. He says più crescendo, even more crescendo, and then, of course, he bursts in with the major theme of the whole piece, the one that you heard way back, that you will hear, actually, way back at the beginning after the slow introduction. This theme here. Now, this one is going to be heard in presto tempo, so that you will hear instead of that, you'll hear this. What you heard in the Leonore number 3 was the theme done twice as fast as that in presto tempo. So this is going to sound quite different. Also, remember that passage with the crunching syncopations that we talked about, and you just heard, as a matter of fact, the one in double forte that had these chords. Beethoven turns that around. He starts it very soft and has the chords on the beat this time, but with the bass notes just anticipating those chords all of the time, like this. And it's piano. And then he says double forte, so then the same thing is repeated, and he really cracks you right over the skull with it. Then one of the greatest crescendos and climaxes, I think, that anybody ever wrote in anything. Towards the very end, big, massive crescendo going up the scale, finally on these chords. With that hair-raising dissonance on the minor 9th chord, we come to the final climax of the whole piece. So let's listen, before we go back and listen to the whole of it, let's listen to the presto section, the coda section of Leonore Overture number 3. Okay, I guess we've torn apart those 2 overtures considerably, and I think we're ready to hear one all the way through, putting it back together all of a piece.
That was Professor Roland Nadeau, and you're listening to A Note to You. This program, all about the Fidelio overtures of Beethoven, is a repeat broadcast of one of the best programs of his distinguished broadcasting career. I'm Virginia Eskin, and I've been having a good time making brand new programs for you. We'll be airing them come January. If you have any comments or questions about the program, write us at A Note to You, care of WGBH Radio, 125 Western Avenue, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. The email address is A Note to You, all one word, at wgbh.org. A Note to You is made possible by the friends and alumni of Northeastern University.
Let's listen now to the Leonore Overture No. 3, the one that I personally consider the greatest of the three, although I love them all. And the performance is going to be by the Philharmonia Orchestra with Otto Klemperer conducting on EMI. And I'll give you these numbers later on. Oh, there it is, the very, very great Leonore Overture Number 3 by Beethoven from 1805-1806. That was written for the second version. I think probably it's the greatest of all four overtures that deal with the great opera Fidelio. The Leonore 1, 2, and 3, and then finally, the one that is used today when you go hear the opera, the one that prefaces the whole thing, is the Fidelio Overture, the 1814 version, none of those overtures that we have been analyzing. So let's listen to it, the Fidelio Overture to the opera Fidelio by Beethoven. Ah, what a nice piece by Beethoven from 1814 for the final version of his wonderful opera, his Singspiel Fidelio. So we've heard parts of all four of the overtures associated with that opera by Beethoven. We've heard two all the way through. But this one here, Fidelio, is almost a third, about two-thirds shorter than the one that we just heard before. And also, it's much, much lighter. And I think that makes sense if you go to the opera, because there's a lot of buffa, there's a lot of fun going on at the very beginning. Imagine this. Marceline, who's the daughter of the jailer Rocco, okay? She's loved by Giacchino, who's the turnkey. She falls in love in turn with this young boy that's working for her father now. He just got the job. His name is Fidelio. But the whole audience knows that Fidelio is actually Leonore of the overtures we've just been hearing, right? Leonore in disguise. So there's a lot of fun at the beginning, and then, of course, it becomes very melodramatic and powerful and dramatic, and it ends with a great exultation at the very end, typical of the Beethoven endings. Otto Klemperer was the conductor of all of these examples today. That is on EMI, and the numbers there are 3247.
Roland Nadeau, waxing eloquent on one of his favorite topics, the music of Beethoven. I hope you've enjoyed this repeat broadcast. Next week, we'll delve into the archives again for Music in the Key of Love. I was the guest, and we had fun with the amorous music of Schubert, Liszt, and Mendelssohn. The engineer for today's program is Janie Pippick. Our producer is Alan McClellan, and I'm Virginia Eskin. A Note to You is made possible by the friends and alumni of Northeastern University. It's produced by Northeastern in cooperation with WGBH in Boston.